continent definitely that is playing its part. So let me bring in Professor Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy. Let me just introduce him again from South Africa, and also Joseph Mithika, the Executive Director at PACJA. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us here on Bottom Line Africa today. So let me begin with you, Mr. Mithika. When you're talking about, Africa playing its part when it comes to climate change, we're seeing Kenya has also decided to play its part by launching the first ever school on climate justice. What does this school and what does it mean for the country, and what will this school be involved in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Brenda, and thank you again for inviting us to this esteemed studio. Yes, indeed, we have a very unique school at Kenyatta University. We launched it yesterday in a symposium. And right now, as we speak, I know they are watching. We have requested them to watch as this program continues. We have brought together participants from 45 countries, not only in Africa, but across the world. And the purpose of this school is to impart knowledge, is to share knowledge, is to exchange, perspectives, and bring together the new generation of young people and scholars like Patrick Bond and those others teaching in universities, so that we are able to demystify and simplify the subject of climate change. So here you are talking about climate change, but there we are talking about climate justice. And why we are doing that is that we have been participating in global discourse on climate change, which is very complicated, which is very complex. It is very difficult for communities and society to relate what is happening at their midst. The people you are seeing there in Mozambique, the hurricane victims. And right now, Mozambique, and also right now we are experiencing that in Algeria and many hotspots in Africa. And this is actually a reality. But people have not been able to relate with that on their daily livelihood efforts. Because it is so scientific, so environmental, that we find climate change as a far away distance issue, whereas it is affecting us.
So, Professor Bond, I mean, the school is also expected to address the poor representation, because Africa, the larger African continent, feels like it's been left out when we are talking about issues to do with climate justice. So when we say climate justice, how will this help the larger African continent to be included on the conversation when they're coming around the table to talk about climate change?
Well, I think the main thing that the Kenyatta University and PACJA in Alliance have done, I wish we could do it in South Africa with our universities, is really prepare a new generation of potential lobbyists and advocates and activists, change makers, people with incoming solutions. Now, the big question, as you say, is the North-South power that leaves African voices completely muffled. So if you start the show with Angela Merkel giving 70 million vaccine doses to Africa, well, that's wonderful, but it's still crumbs. It's about 5% of the continent's needs. And as my president, Cyril Ramaphosa, said, it's terribly unfair. So we see that in Glasgow, which is in 2 months, the UN Climate Summit. And because Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel, although she's leaving her job in a couple of weeks, the elites that are managing it, even John Kerry, really don't have a plan to raise African voices and to bring them in. They've basically managed to create a cordon sanitaire for climate justice activists and those from Africa. And the reason is they've got these very high prices for hotels with a quarantine period. So I find it so, let me say, hypocritical for Merkel, who, if you recall, Kenyan government with South Africa, India, and Eswatini said we need to have a waiver on intellectual property for the vaccines so many, many more Africans can get jabbed. And that's what, your show is promoting. And yet, again and again, both Merkel and Boris Johnson are blocking the vaccine waiver in the World Trade Organization and just throwing some crumbs. That's the sort of spirit that Mithika Mwenda and the Paksha activists are already encountering, in fact, since Copenhagen in 2009, when they're dealing with a kind of northern, let me allow me to say it, a climate apartheid or even a climate imperialism. And I hope the 500 or so people involved in this school, many online, but many here, are following WHO, following masking and social distancing. And it's really an important step forward just to show how you do this sort of summit.
All right, and I know viewers are wondering what I mean by PACJA. PACJA simply means Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, that has come to, together with other stakeholders just to come up with this summit. But then, Mr. Mithika, when we talk about climate justice and you're bringing different stakeholders into this summit, students were selected for admission to the pilot program, and more stakeholders from across the globe will be joining this online via Zoom and other platforms. What were you looking at? Must you be an environmentalist champion?
Certainly no. You may not be environmentalist. Here we have social scientists. We have people from all backgrounds. We have young people in agriculture. We have young people from forestry. We have young people who are doing various courses. And the purpose of that is we want to expand beyond the scope of environment and science, because this is an issue which is affecting agriculture. It's affecting pastoralists, it is affecting women, it is affecting the businesses and everything. So what we want to do is actually to expand that so that everyone understands that climate change is an issue of justice, and first and foremost, climate change is an issue of business, is an issue which affects women, it's an issue which affects youth and everybody in the society. So that is actually how we are opening it. And I started by saying we want really to demystify that. It's a daily issue, we have to confront it.
All right, and I like the fact that you're saying that it's a daily issue that has to be confronted. And Professor Bond, just hearing what Mr. Mithika has to say, has said a few minutes ago, it looks like the people, the target group, mostly it's the young generation. Yet, yes, we're talking about the young generation being at the forefront in terms of, doing all it can so that the environment is not affected negatively. But then within the African continent, when we talk about climate change, we're just thinking about the Western countries.
Well, yes and no. I think the generational anger, that's going to be universal. We're seeing some great young activists from Africa joining the very famous Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, taking the stage. But they're also fighting against fossil fuel extraction, very successfully here in Lamu, for example. But also the most critical site is where there's the 4th largest gas field in the world, which is off of Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. And it's so tragic that, unfortunately, many of the youth are actually being recruited into the armies of Rwanda and South Africa to go and defend French oil companies, Total, ExxonMobil from the US, Eni from Italy, or Sasol from South Africa, or China National Petroleum. And I think the youth that are out there actually being part of the problem, which is extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, and oil. We have many Nigerians who are always the leaders in this area of leaving the oil, leaving the gas underground. The youth are going to have to ask my generation, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you insist that we move quicker to renewable energy and that we find a climate debt demand to justify not extracting fossil fuels and making money, but instead the North owes us, the North owes Africa. Kenya is the 4th hardest hit the last 20 years. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, the 3 worst hit.
So, Prof, what you're telling us is that the African continent is actually, we're actually suffering from the most severe forms of climate injustices.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Because so few of the emissions out there in the world come from the African continent. Actually, 40% come from my country, South Africa. So I often say that South Africa owes our region, and East Africa, with all the locusts, the drying soils, the snowmelt from Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro, the ocean rising sea levels. We owe you, actually, a climate debt because South Africa has a very high carbon intensity. So it's this injustice that now adds more layers. In South Africa, it's mostly white people who are the beneficiaries, with many black people not having access to the coal-fired electricity in any case because it's too expensive and they're disconnected. So I think this is the essence of climate justice, to really find a nuanced understanding of who caused the problem, who is suffering, and then to demand the reparations required to make things right.
So, Mr. Mithika, you know, the School on Climate Justice, is it a one thing, like a yearly thing, or it's a school that has been opened? Actually, that school has been opened at the KU, if I'm not wrong, Mr. Mithika.
The KU, what's happening is inaugural. So we are, as Patrick has said, it's a pilot. We want to understand how it works. By the way, the issue of climate justice, as we are talking about climate change, the discourse now has completely deviated. It's no longer that science we are talking about. And so the discussion, introducing it into the academic system, into research, into institutions of higher learning and lower learning, we want to really ensure that the current generation and the future generation, the young generation, are able to understand the challenge which is confronting them. And so this is going to continue. In fact, we are in discussion with several universities, including Kenyatta University, Nairobi University, so that we can introduce this as a course. The way it is happening in the North, actually, they are really advanced. The climate justice is an examinable subject. But here in Africa, we just follow. So that means, you see, shaping the discourse is very important. Shaping policies. How are we going to do it when we are not involving our institutions of higher learning, research institutions, policy think tanks, and so forth? So that is actually the beginning of what we want to do, and we are planting a seed at Kenyatta University.
All right, planting a seed at Kenyatta University. So, gentlemen, let me just go through the story that I've been told about by my director, if I may have it, you know, just there on the auto cue, just to get your feedback, you know, your sentiment on it. So there we go. Kefa, if you can help me from the top, I'll really appreciate. Okay, so there we go. So definitely we've had a discussion about this climate change, and it is important to note that the unfolding